The breathtaking historical discovery that would bring historians and treasure hunters from across the nation to a forgotten Georgia town. A legendary Civil War fortune that had remained hidden for over 150 years. All triggered by one woman's determination to rebuild her life after personal tragedy and the dilapidated warehouse that contained a coded journal leading to what experts would call the most significant Civil War treasure ever recovered. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The summer heat pressed down on Rebecca Collins as she pulled her weathered sedan into the cracked parking lot of what was apparently now her property. At 36, the recently widowed mother of a teenage daughter had received the certified letter 2 weeks earlier informing her that a great-uncle she'd barely remembered had left her his commercial property and all contents thereof in the small town of Millbrook, Georgia, 3 hours from her modest apartment in Atlanta. "Is that it?" asked 15-year-old Zoe, peering through the windshield at the faded brick building with boarded windows and a partially collapsed metal roof. "That's what the lawyer said." 1842 Railroad Avenue, Rebecca confirmed, trying to hide her disappointment. She'd hoped this unexpected inheritance might somehow ease their financial strain after her husband Michael's sudden death last year. Between the medical bills, funeral expenses, and trying to maintain their lifestyle on her librarian's salary alone, they had been drowning. Instead, she faced a decrepit warehouse with graffiti-covered walls and an overgrown lot strewn with decades of debris. "It's kind of cool in a post-apocalyptic way," Zoe remarked, her artistic eye already framing potential photographs. Since her father's death, she'd retreated into her photography, capturing abandoned places and forgotten corners of the world. As they sat contemplating the building, a pickup truck rumbled into the lot beside them. An elderly black man in overalls emerged, approaching with a friendly wave. "You must be Bob Harrington's people," he called, extending a weathered hand. "I'm Isaiah Washington. Been keeping an eye on this place since your uncle passed." Rebecca shook his hand, surprised by the warm welcome. "I didn't really know him. I think I met him once at a family reunion when I was a child." Isaiah nodded knowingly. Bob was a peculiar man, kept to himself mostly. Been in Millbrook all his life, but still felt like a stranger passing through. "Said he was custodian of history, whatever that meant," he chuckled. "Always writing in those journals of his." "Did he actually run a business here?" Rebecca asked, gesturing toward the warehouse. "Not for decades. Called it an antiquities repository on paper, but I never saw him sell a single thing. Just collected old books, maps, war memorabilia, Civil War stuff mostly." Isaiah helped them force open the rusted door, revealing an interior that took Rebecca's breath away, not with grandeur, but with the sheer volume of accumulated history. The cavernous space was filled with towering shelves, display cases, and stacks of wooden crates. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light, streaming through holes in the roof. "Uncle Bob lived here?" she asked incredulously, noting a small living area partitioned off in one corner with a cot, kitchenette, and ancient television. "Moved in about 20 years ago after selling his house," Isaiah confirmed. "Said he needed to be with his work day and night. Electric still runs, though. The plumbing's questionable. Water comes from a well out back." After Isaiah left, promising to return the next morning with some tools to help secure the leaking roof, Rebecca and Zoe began to explore their inheritance. Despite the building's decrepit exterior, the contents were meticulously organized. Each shelf was labeled with handwritten cards denoting time periods, geographic regions, or military units. "Mom, look at this," Zoe called from a corner dominated by glass display cases. Inside were Civil War-era weapons, uniforms, and personal effects, each with detailed provenance notes in Bob Harrington's precise handwriting. "These must be worth something," Rebecca mused, examining a Confederate officer's sword with mother-of-pearl inlay on the handle. Maybe we could sell some pieces to museums. As they continued their exploration, Rebecca discovered a roll-top desk tucked away behind the living area. Inside were dozens of leather-bound journals spanning decades, each filled with her great-uncles. Cramped writing. Opening the most recent volume, she found entries dated just weeks before his death. "Listen to this," she called to Zoe. June 15, 2024. Another promising lead came to nothing. The Reynolds letter mentioned beneath the Twin Sentinels, but there are no such landmarks on any contemporary maps. The Caldwell diary remains the key, but its code resists conventional analysis. Time grows short. The custodianship must continue. "What's the custodianship?" Zoe asked, peering over her mother's shoulder. "I have no idea," Rebecca replied, flipping through earlier entries, "but he mentions it repeatedly. And something called the Beauregard Legacy." That evening, in their motel room, Rebecca researched General Pierre Gustave Toutant Beauregard, a prominent Confederate commander during the Civil War, known as the Napoleon in Gray. He had commanded forces at Fort Sumter when the first shots of the war were fired. But nothing in his official history seemed connected to their small Georgia town or explained her great-uncle's obsession. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "Maybe he was just a history buff with a Beauregard fixation," she suggested to Zoe over dinner. "I don't think so," Zoe replied, scrolling through photos she'd taken of the warehouse interior. "Look at this." She zoomed in on a framed document, partially visible behind stacks of books. It's a letter signed by Beauregard himself, dated April 1865. Rebecca studied the image, reading aloud. "Entrust to your care these assets of the Confederacy. When our cause rises again, these resources shall fuel its resurrection. Until then, you and your descendants stand as guardians." "Mom, what if Uncle Bob was looking for lost Confederate gold?" Zoe's eyes sparkled with excitement. "Like a real treasure hunt?" Rebecca shook her head, amused by her daughter's enthusiasm. "Those are just legends, honey. Besides, if there had been any truth to it, the gold would have been found long ago." The next morning, they returned to the warehouse where Isaiah was already patching holes in the roof. While Rebecca sorted through papers at the desk, hoping to find information about the property's tax status and upkeep costs, Zoe explored the back rooms with her camera. "Mom!" Her excited shout echoed through the warehouse. "You need to see this." Rebecca followed her daughter's voice to a small office she hadn't noticed before, hidden behind tall shelving units. Inside, one entire wall was covered with maps, photographs, and handwritten notes, all connected by red string, the kind of investigation board seen in detective movies. At the center was a large Civil War-era map of Georgia with several locations circled in red. Sticky notes attached to each circle contained dates. Excavated 1978, nothing. Search 2002, collapsed tunnel. Ground penetrating radar 2019, inconclusive. "He was definitely hunting for something," Zoe whispered, as if they might be overheard. "And look at this." She pointed to a framed daguerreotype photograph of a stern-looking Confederate officer standing beside a wooden crate. The handwritten note beneath it read, "Colonel Thomas Winfield with one of 17 gold shipments, 1,864. Photograph authenticated 1997. As Rebecca examined the investigation wall, she noticed a modern satellite map with several locations, marked with different colored pins. One red pin was placed directly under their current location, the warehouse itself. He thought something was hidden here. She wondered aloud, looking down at the concrete floor beneath their feet. That evening, Rebecca spoke with Harrison Bailey, the local attorney who had handled Bob Harrington's estate. Meeting at a small diner in Millbrook's town square, The elderly lawyer provided little additional information about her great-uncle. Robert was intensely private about his research, Bailey explained, stirring his coffee. I handled his legal affairs for 30 years, but he shared only what was necessary. I do know he spent his entire inheritance from your grandfather acquiring that property and its contents. Was he? Rebecca hesitated, searching for a delicate way to phrase her question. Was he mentally sound? All this treasure hunting seems a bit obsessive, Bailey smiled knowingly. Robert was eccentric, certainly, but completely rational. He held a doctorate in history from Emory University before dedicating himself to what he called field research. And I should mention, the property comes with certain conditions. Rebecca tensed. What kind of conditions? The warehouse and its contents must remain intact and in family possession for at least 1 year before any sale or dispersal of assets. Robert was quite insistent on this point. That's ridiculous, Rebecca protested. I can't maintain that. Building for a year, I have a job, a life back in Atlanta. Bailey shrugged sympathetically. Those are the terms. If you decline the inheritance, the property reverts to the Historical Society of Georgia, though they've indicated they lack resources to maintain it properly. Rebecca drove back to the motel in frustrated silence. She had hoped to quickly sell the property and use the funds to secure a more stable future for herself and Zoe. Now she was faced with an impossible choice: abandon a potentially valuable inheritance or somehow manage a dilapidated warehouse 3 hours from home for an entire year. In their motel room, she found Zoe engrossed in one of the journals she'd borrowed from the warehouse. "Mom, listen to this," Zoe said without looking up. October 4th, 1967. Grandfather passed today. With his final breath, he transferred the custodianship to me, as his father did before him. The Beauregard cache remains elusive, but the Winfield cipher may hold the key. The burden is now mine. So this treasure hunt has been going on for generations? Rebecca asked, sitting heavily on the bed. It gets weirder, Zoe continued. He writes about a family mark that proves our lineage as rightful custodians. Listen, the star-crossed birthmark appears in every third generation, marking the true custodian. Father lacked it, as do I, but perhaps my successor will bear the sign. Rebecca froze, her hand instinctively moving to her right shoulder blade, where a small star-shaped birthmark had been present since birth. The same mark had appeared on Zoe's shoulder, something they had always considered a charming coincidence. "Mom?" Zoe noticed her reaction. "What is it?" Before Rebecca could respond, her phone rang. The motel manager informed her that someone had broken into the warehouse. Police were on scene and requesting the property owner's presence immediately. They arrived to find 2 police cruisers in the parking lot, their lights casting eerie blue and red patterns across the brick facade. Inside, Officers Thompson and Rodriguez were examining a section of the concrete floor that had been partially broken up with a sledgehammer. "Caught them in the act," Officer Thompson explained, gesturing toward the patrol car where a young man sat in the back seat. "Local troublemaker named Darrell Simmons. Claims he was just exploring, but brought along some serious tools." "How did he get in?" Rebecca asked, surveying the damage. "Back window was already broken," Rodriguez replied. "Alarm system's been disabled for years. You might want to consider better security if you're keeping this place." After the police left, promising to file charges against the intruder, Rebecca examined the damaged floor more closely. The concrete had been broken to reveal older wooden planking beneath. Not unusual in a building of this age where new floors were often poured over original structures. Why would he break up the floor? She wondered aloud. Isaiah, who had arrived during the commotion, shook his head grimly. Rumors, most likely. There's been talk in town for generations about Civil War gold hidden in these parts. Bob's research didn't exactly stay secret in a town this size. That night in the motel, Rebecca couldn't sleep. The break-in, combined with the strange conditions of her inheritance and the generations-long search documented in the journals, left her mind racing. Around 2 a.m., she gave up on sleep and began reviewing the photographs Zoe had taken of the investigation wall. One image captured a page from what appeared to be a field diary, partially visible beneath other papers. Zooming in, she could make out a passage. April 28, 1865. With the cause lost, COLW has ordered the reserve treasury dispersed among 17 trusted officers. Each carries one crate to separate locations across Georgia and the Carolinas. The master manifest remains with COLW, encoded according to the Beauregard cipher. God willing, these resources shall fuel our resurgence when the time comes. The date struck her as significant, weeks after General Lee's surrender at Appomattox. If Confederate gold had still been moving at that point, it would have been among the last remnants of the treasury, desperately being hidden from advancing Union forces. Rebecca pulled out her laptop and began researching Colonel Thomas Winfield, finding only brief mentions in Civil War records. A cavalry officer under Beauregard's command, he had disappeared in late 1865, presumed killed by Union patrols or deserters. His body was never recovered. As dawn broke, Rebecca had made a decision. She would use her 2 weeks of vacation time to properly investigate the warehouse and her great-uncle's research. If nothing else, organizing the collection might increase its value for eventual sale once the 1-year requirement was satisfied. What Rebecca couldn't know as she finally drifted off to sleep was that her decision would uncover not just a forgotten piece of Civil War history, but a secret that powerful people had been working to keep buried for generations. And that her inherited custodianship would soon place her and Zoe at the center of a mystery that would reach to the highest levels of government and change the historical narrative of an entire nation. As morning sunlight filtered through the motel curtains, Rebecca was already planning their systematic investigation of the warehouse. Little did she know that a black SUV was parked across the street, its occupant photographing their car. Room door while speaking quietly into a secure satellite phone. Asset location confirmed, the man reported. Custodianship appears to have transferred. Monitoring continued interactions with the Harrington collection. No indication of cipher. Awareness at this time. 2 weeks stretched into a month as Rebecca Collins immersed herself in the sprawling collection her great-uncle had assembled. What began as a reluctant obligation transformed into an absorbing puzzle that rekindled her long-dormant passion for historical research. Her background as a librarian proved invaluable as she cataloged journals, letters, and artifacts spanning more than 150 years of her family's mysterious custodianship. "I've requested extended leave from the library," she told Zoe over breakfast at Millbrook's only cafe, the Southern Peach. Mrs. Abernathy was surprisingly understanding when I explained about the inheritance. "So we're staying?" Zoe asked, trying to mask her excitement. Since arriving in Millbrook, the teenager had flourished, her photography expanding to document the town's fading historical buildings and the characters who inhabited them. "At least through summer," Rebecca confirmed. "I've spoken with Principal Edwards at the high school. You can transfer for fall semester if we're still here." The local community had embraced them with surprising warmth. Isaiah Washington had introduced them to his extended family, including his grandson Marcus, a history teacher at the high school, who shared their fascination with the Beauregard mystery. Elderly residents brought casseroles and shared stories about old Bob Harrington and his peculiar ways. "People thought he was crazy," explained Mabel Thorne, the 82-year-old owner of the antique shop across from the warehouse, spending his whole life chasing legends. "But he was always kind, always respectful of our town's history." With Marcus Washington's help, Rebecca had installed basic security measures, new locks, motion-sensing lights, and wireless cameras that sent alerts to her phone. The broken concrete floor had been properly removed to reveal the original wooden planking beneath, which Marcus identified as dating to the building's 1858 construction as a cotton warehouse. This building survived Sherman's march, he'd explained, running his hand over the worn planks. One of the few commercial structures in this region that wasn't burned. On this particular morning, Rebecca returned to the warehouse after breakfast to find a middle-aged man in expensive suit examining the exterior. His luxury sedan with government plates seemed jarringly out of place in rural Millbrook. "Miss Collins?" he inquired as she approached. "I'm Richard Grayson, Department of Historical Preservation. May I have a word?" Inside, Grayson surveyed the collection with poorly concealed interest, asking pointed questions about her great-uncle's research and whether she'd discovered any documents of historical significance. "The department has a particular interest in Civil War-era communications," he explained, handing her his card. "Especially anything related to the final months of the conflict. We'd be willing to offer substantial grants for proper preservation." After Grayson departed, promising to return with formal proposal documents, Rebecca called Marcus Washington. "Have you ever heard of the Department of Historical Preservation?" she asked. "That's not a real department," Marcus replied after a moment's hesitation. "At least not one I'm familiar with. Did this person show credentials?" The conversation left Rebecca uneasy. She spent the afternoon reviewing the security camera footage Isaiah had helped install, noting that Grayson had arrived at 6:15 a.m., more than 2 hours before she'd encountered him, and had spent considerable time examining the perimeter of the building. That evening, she and Zoe made a thorough search of the warehouse, looking for anything that might explain the stranger's interest. In a concealed drawer beneath her great-uncle's desk, they discovered a small leather pouch containing a brass key unlike any modern design, with elaborate scrollwork and the initials TW engraved on its bow. "Thomas Winfield," Zoe whispered, connecting it to the Confederate colonel from their research. Alongside the key was a fragile piece of parchment bearing a grid of seemingly random letters, a cipher or code of some kind, and a small tintype photograph of a stone church with a steeple. "I recognize this building," Marcus said when they showed him their discoveries the next day. "It's the old Calvary Episcopal Church outside town. Been abandoned since the 1930s when the congregation built a larger church closer to town." With Marcus as their guide, they drove to the derelict church that afternoon. The stone structure stood in a small clearing surrounded by ancient oak trees, its wooden doors long rotted away and windows broken. Inside, nature had reclaimed much of the interior, with vines growing across pews and part of the ceiling collapsed. "The church dates to 1851, Marcus explained, his historian's knowledge evident. "It served as a field hospital during the Battle of Millbrook Crossing in 1864, Confederate wounded primarily." As they explored the ruins, Zoe's photographer's eye noted something unusual about the stone floor near the altar. "These flagstones don't match," she observed, pointing to a section where the pattern of the flooring subtly changed. Working together, they managed to lift one of the irregular stones, revealing a small cavity beneath. Inside was a metal box, approximately the size of a large book, its surface corroded with age. The brass key fit perfectly in the lock. Inside the box they found a leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with columns of numbers and letters, and a smaller oilskin packet containing what appeared to be military orders signed by General Beauregard himself, dated April 12, 1865, 3 days after Lee's surrender at Appomattox. Marcus breathed, handling the document with reverent care. The orders designated Colonel Thomas Winfield as Special Treasury Custodian and authorized him to secure remaining assets of the Confederate Treasury by all means necessary to prevent capture by Union forces. "This confirms the gold shipments," "We're real," Rebecca said, excitement building. "But how does this connect to my family? And why has this custodianship been passed down for generations?" The answer came that evening as they carefully examined the contents of the metal box at the warehouse. Hidden in a false bottom of the box was a faded daguerreotype showing Colonel Winfield, standing beside a woman whose features bore a striking resemblance to Rebecca herself. The back of the photograph bore an inscription: "Colonel Thomas Winfield and Elizabeth Harrington Winfield, 1863. "Harrington," Rebecca whispered. "She must be my great-great-great-grandmother or something similar." The family connection. Further research in her great-uncle's journals revealed the story. Thomas Winfield had married Elizabeth Harrington in 1862 during a brief leave from the front. When the war ended in Confederate defeat, Winfield had entrusted his wife's family with safeguarding the secret of the dispersed treasury, fearing his own capture as a known Confederate officer. The custodianship wasn't just about protecting gold, Rebecca realized as she read through generations of journal entries. It was about protecting the truth that the Confederacy had managed to hide significant portions of its treasury from Union forces. The following morning, Rebecca woke to multiple alerts from the warehouse security system. Arriving with Marcus, they found the building surrounded by vehicles, not local police, but unmarked black SUVs with tinted windows, men in tactical gear secured the perimeter while others in suits directed operations from a mobile command center. Richard Grayson approached as they pulled up, his demeanor transformed from cordial to commanding. "Miss Collins, I need you to surrender all materials recovered from Calvary Episcopal yesterday," he stated without preamble. "This is now a federal matter." "Under what authority?" Marcus demanded, positioning himself protectively beside Rebecca. "National Security Presidential Directive 58, Grayson replied. "Classification of Civil War-era assets with ongoing security implications." "That's not a real thing," Marcus countered, his knowledge of history serving him well. "There's no such directive." Grayson's expression hardened. "Mr. Washington, your grandfather Isaiah has already been detained for questioning regarding his assistance in unauthorized excavation of historical artifacts. I suggest you both cooperate fully." The mention of Isaiah sent a chill through Rebecca. "Where is he? What have you done with him?" "He's perfectly safe," Grayson assured her with practiced smoothness. "As will you and your daughter be if you provide the ledger and cipher key recovered yesterday." A commotion from inside the warehouse drew their attention. Zoe emerged, escorted by 2 agents, her expression a mixture of fear and defiance. "Mom, they're taking everything, all of Great Uncle Bob's research, the journals, everything." Before Rebecca could respond, an authoritative voice cut through the tension. "That's quite enough, Director Grayson." All heads turned to see an elderly man in a wheelchair being assisted from a town car that had arrived unnoticed during the confrontation. Despite his apparent physical frailty, the newcomer's bearing commanded immediate respect. The agents, including Grayson, straightened perceptibly. "Governor Caldwell," Grayson acknowledged, his tone modulating to careful deference. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "Cut the horseshit, Richard," the elderly man replied sharply. "Call off your dogs. You're operating well outside your jurisdiction, and you know it." William Caldwell, former governor of Georgia and still one of the state's most influential political figures, had arrived with his own entourage, not federal agents, but state law enforcement and legal counsel. "Miss Collins," he addressed Rebecca directly, "I apologize for this intrusion. I've been monitoring the situation since you inherited your great-uncle's property. I had hoped to approach you more conventionally, but Director Grayson's overzealousness has forced my hand." Over the next hour, an extraordinary scene unfolded as Governor Caldwell effectively countermanded the federal operation. State police secured the release of Isaiah Washington while Caldwell's legal team presented documentation challenging the federal jurisdiction. The Beauregard legacy falls under state historical preservation statutes, Caldwell's chief counsel explained. To an increasingly frustrated Grayson, any artifacts recovered remain the property of the state of Georgia unless voluntarily surrendered by the legitimate custodian. By afternoon, the federal agents had withdrawn, though surveillance vehicles remained visibly stationed at town entry points. Governor Caldwell invited Rebecca, Zoe, Marcus, and the recently released Isaiah to join him at Millbrook's small historical society building, which had been hastily secured by his staff. "I've known about your family's custodianship for decades," Caldwell explained once they were settled in the society's conference room. "My grandfather served with Thomas Winfield and was one of the 17 officers entrusted with a portion of the treasury." He gestured, and an aide brought forward an aged wooden box inlaid with mother-of-pearl. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a single gold coin, a $20 double eagle minted in 1861. Confederate gold, Caldwell confirmed. One of thousands hidden across the South in the war's final days. "My family protected our portion of the legacy, just as yours protected the master manifest and cipher key." "But why all the secrecy?" Rebecca asked. "The Civil War ended over 150 years ago. Why would the federal government still care about Confederate gold?" "Because it's not just about gold," Isaiah Washington interjected, his deep voice carrying the weight of generational knowledge. "It's about what the gold was intended to fund." Governor Caldwell nodded soberly. "The popular narrative is that the Confederacy was bankrupt by war's end, its treasury depleted or captured. That narrative serves both North and South, allowing for a clean historical break and reunification narrative. But it's not true," Marcus concluded, his historian's mind connecting the pieces. "Not entirely," Caldwell confirmed. "Significant portions of the Confederate treasury were successfully hidden, not to restart the war, as some feared, but to rebuild the devastated South. The original plan was for a 5-year sequestration, after which the assets would fund reconstruction efforts independent of Northern control." "So what went wrong?" Zoe asked, her youthful directness cutting to the heart of the matter. "Politics, corruption, human nature," Caldwell sighed. "Some custodians used their portions for personal gain. Others were discovered and arrested by federal authorities. Most significantly, the Master Manifest, which your ancestors safeguarded, was encrypted using a cipher that was lost when Colonel Winfield died unexpectedly in 1866. Without the cipher, no one could locate all 17 caches," Rebecca reasoned. "Precisely," Caldwell confirmed. "Over generations, stories of the hidden Confederate gold became legend. Most people dismissed them as myth. But certain federal agencies have maintained active searches, particularly during times of economic crisis when a sudden influx of 19th century gold could destabilize currency markets." The conversation continued late into the evening as Caldwell shared historical context that had been absent from Rebecca's great-uncle's research. The gold caches weren't merely treasure, they represented an alternative history of Reconstruction, one in which the South might have rebuilt with greater independence and dignity. "Your great-uncle Robert came closer than anyone to deciphering Winfield's code," Caldwell explained. "That's why Director Grayson is so interested in his research. The National Historical Security Division has operated as a shadow agency since the 1940s, tasked with controlling historically sensitive assets that could disrupt modern political or economic systems." "So what happens now?" Rebecca asked, exhaustion evident in her voice after the day's events. "That depends on you," Caldwell replied, studying her intently. "As the current custodian, the decision is yours. We can secure the ledger and cipher in the state archives, continuing the generations of secrecy. Or we can try to solve the puzzle once and for all," Rebecca finished, feeling the weight of history pressing upon her shoulders. As they departed the Historical Society building under the protection of Governor Caldwell's security detail, Rebecca noticed something she'd overlooked in the chaos of the day. The star-shaped birthmark on her shoulder had been throbbing with a dull, persistent ache ever since they'd discovered the metal box in the church floor. Back at the motel, after ensuring Zoe was safely asleep, Rebecca examined the mark in the bathroom mirror. The normally flat birthmark appeared slightly raised, its outline more pronounced than usual. As she touched it gently, a memory surfaced. From her childhood, her grandmother applying a special salve to the mark during a summer visit, whispering, "The star will guide you when the time comes." At that moment, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "The star is not just a birthmark. Meet tomorrow, Dawn, at the church. Come alone. A friend." What Rebecca couldn't know as she stared at the cryptic message was that her inheritance extended far beyond a dilapidated warehouse and Civil War memorabilia. She had unknowingly stepped into a role prepared for her across generations, and the birthmark she had always considered a simple family trait was about to reveal itself as something far more significant in the quest to uncover one of American history's most closely guarded secrets. As first light painted the sky in delicate pinks and golds, Rebecca stood before the ruins of Calvary Episcopal Church, her breath forming small clouds in the cool morning air. The text message had been risky to trust, but something deeper than logic had drawn her here, the same intuition that had kept her in Millbrook, long after practical considerations suggested returning to Atlanta. Rebecca's hand instinctively moved to the small revolver in her jacket pocket, a loan from Governor Caldwell's security chief following yesterday's confrontation. The weight of it felt foreign against her hip, a tangible reminder of how dramatically her life had changed in the week since inheriting her great-uncle's warehouse. The librarian from Atlanta, who had always found safety in books and order, now stood alone at dawn, awaiting a mysterious meeting that might reveal secrets hidden for over a century and a half. A twig snapped behind her, and Rebecca spun to face a slender woman in her 70s emerging from the tree line. Dressed in practical outdoor clothing with silver hair pulled back in a neat braid, she carried herself with the straight-backed posture of military training despite her age. "You have his eyes," the woman said without preamble. Robert's eyes, observant, questioning. "Who are you?" Rebecca kept her hand near the concealed weapon. "Margaret Winfield," the woman replied, extending her hand. "Your distant cousin, though the exact relation would require a genealogist. I served as your great-uncle's research partner for 30 years. He never mentioned you in his journals," Rebecca said cautiously, not taking the offered hand. Margaret smiled slightly. "Not by name, no. He referred to me as Mabu for security reasons. The fewer people who could connect the Winfield and Harrington bloodlines, the safer we all remained." She gestured toward a fallen log near the church entrance. "May we sit? My knees aren't what they once were, and we have much to discuss before." Grayson's surveillance drones make their morning pass. The mention of Grayson, the federal agent who had tried to seize her great-uncle's research, lent credibility to the woman's claims. Rebecca nodded, following Margaret to the makeshift seat while maintaining a cautious distance. "I've been monitoring you since you arrived in Millbrook," Margaret explained, producing a small tablet from her backpack. "Your decision to stay, to investigate rather than liquidate Robert's collection, suggested you might be worthy of the custodianship." She tapped the tablet screen, bringing up a series of photographs showing Rebecca and Zoe exploring the warehouse, meeting with Marcus Washington, discovering the hidden box in the church floor. The surveillance was disturbing, but Margaret continued before Rebecca could object. "Your birthmark," she said, nodding toward Rebecca's shoulder. "It's activating, isn't it? Becoming more pronounced, occasionally warm or painful." Rebecca's surprise confirmed the observation. "How could you possibly know that?" "Because mine did the same 50 years ago." Margaret pulled aside her collar to reveal an identical star-shaped mark on her collarbone. The star cross appears in select members of both the Winfield and Harrington lines. It's not just a birthmark, it's a genetic marker intentionally created and preserved through careful family marriages across generations. That's impossible, Rebecca protested. Genetic engineering didn't exist in the 1860s. Not as we understand it today, Margaret agreed. But the custodianship involves technologies and knowledge that have been suppressed from mainstream history. She fixed Rebecca with a penetrating gaze. Tell me, what do you know about the Knights of the Golden Circle? The question seemed tangential, but Rebecca recalled the term from her historical research. A secret society that supported Southern expansion before the Civil War. They wanted to create a slave empire encompassing the southern United States, Mexico, and parts of Central America. That's the sanitized historical version, Margaret nodded. What's not in the textbooks is that the Knights had access to archaeological discoveries that predated European settlement, ancient technologies found in mound builder sites across the Southeast. Margaret produced an aged leather pouch from her backpack, carefully extracting a small object wrapped in silk. Unwrapping it revealed what appeared to be a golden scarab, similar to Egyptian artifacts but with distinctly different markings. This was found in Georgia in 1838, along with dozens of similar artifacts suggesting cultural contact between ancient Egypt and indigenous North American civilizations. The Smithsonian acquired most of the collection, promptly classified it, and has kept it hidden ever since. I don't understand what this has to do with Confederate gold, Rebecca said, though a strange warmth was spreading from her birthmark as she stared at the golden scarab. The Knights believed these artifacts revealed advanced knowledge including medical techniques far beyond 19th century understanding. Thomas Winfield was not just a Confederate officer. He was a high-ranking knight who had studied these ancient techniques. Margaret carefully rewrapped the scarab. When the Confederacy's defeat became inevitable, Winfield and other knight leaders repurposed the Confederate treasury. The gold wasn't just hidden to keep it from Union hands, it was strategically placed at specific locations to preserve something far more valuable. Which was what exactly? Rebecca asked, struggling to process these extraordinary claims. A medical breakthrough derived from their study of ancient techniques, what they called the immortality enzyme. A compound that could dramatically extend human life and heal otherwise fatal injuries. Rebecca laughed incredulously. You're saying Confederate leaders discovered the fountain of youth? I'm saying they discovered something that modern pharmaceutical companies would kill for. Margaret replied without humor. Something that select members of certain families have benefited from ever since. She fixed Rebecca with a steady gaze. Why do you think William Caldwell looks remarkably vigorous for a man supposedly in his 80s? Or why Isaiah Washington can still climb ladders at 75? The custodians and their closest allies have had limited access to the compound for generations. Before Rebecca could formulate a response, Margaret tensed, her attention caught by something in the distance. Drone approaching, we need to move. They retreated inside the church ruins, where the partial roof provided some cover from aerial surveillance. Once settled in a shadowed corner, Margaret continued, her voice lower. The Beauregard cipher isn't just a map to gold caches. It's a medical formula disguised as a treasure map. Each location contains components needed to synthesize the compound, along with gold to fund continued research. Your great-uncle spent his life trying to complete the formula, believing it could revolutionize medicine. If this is true, Rebecca said, still skeptical, why would the government suppress it? A medical breakthrough of that magnitude would benefit humanity. Would it? Margaret challenged. Imagine the geopolitical implications of a treatment that could extend human life by decades or potentially centuries. Who would receive it? Who would be denied? How would power structures change if elite leaders could maintain control for generations? The economic impact alone would be devastating: pension systems, healthcare, inheritance laws all built around our current lifespan. The argument was compelling, though Rebecca still struggled with the fantastical nature of the claims. Yet, the existence of federal agents willing to detain American citizens without due process suggested something of significant value was indeed at stake. "What exactly is my role supposed to be in all this?" she asked finally. "The custodianship passes to those with the activated birthmark, those genetically compatible with the compound itself. Your great-uncle identified you years ago as his likely successor, though he hoped to prepare you gradually rather than thrust you into the situation." Margaret produced a small vial containing an amber liquid. "This activator serum is derived from the partial formula we've managed to reconstruct. It temporarily enhances certain cognitive functions, specifically the ability to perceive patterns in the Beauregard cipher that ordinary consciousness misses." She offered the vial to Rebecca. "One dose will last approximately 6 hours. During that time, you'll be able to see connections in the cipher that have eluded researchers for generations." Rebecca stared at the vial, hesitation warring with curiosity. "You're asking me to take an unknown compound based on a story that sounds like science fiction." "I'm offering you the truth about your family legacy," Margaret corrected. "The choice remains yours. Walk away now, return to Atlanta, and Director Grayson will eventually acquire your great-uncle's research through legal channels or otherwise. The custodianship will end with your generation, and a medical breakthrough that could transform human suffering will remain suppressed." She leaned forward intently. "Or take this step, embrace the responsibility that has been prepared for you across generations, and help us complete what Thomas Winfield started, not for Confederate resurrection, but for humanitarian potential that transcends historical divisions." The moment stretched between them, pregnant with consequence. Finally, Rebecca took the vial, holding it up to catch the early morning light filtering through the broken church. "Windows. If I do this, I need guarantees. Zoe remains safe, no matter what happens. And if we succeed, the formula becomes public knowledge, not controlled by government agencies or private interests." Margaret nodded solemnly. "Those terms align with your great-uncle's wishes. He believed medical breakthroughs belonged to humanity, not institutions." Rebecca uncapped the vial and, with a deep breath, swallowed the contents in one swift motion. The liquid burned slightly going down, spreading warmth through her chest and into her limbs. Within moments, her birthmark began to tingle intensely, the sensation radiating across her shoulder and up her neck. "How long until—" She stopped mid-sentence as the world around her shifted subtly. Colors became more vibrant, sounds more distinct. The ruins of the church seemed to pulse with faint luminescence along certain structural lines that formed geometric patterns previously invisible to her perception. "It's working," Margaret observed, watching Rebecca's eyes track patterns in the stonework. "The activator enhances pattern recognition, especially for designs intentionally incorporated into structures by night architects." Rebecca stood, drawn to a section of the church wall where light and shadow created a complex interplay across the aged stones. "There's something here," she murmured, her fingers tracing invisible lines across the rough surface. "A sequence, hidden in the masonry pattern." Following her intuition, she pressed specific stones in sequence, feeling slight resistance, then subtle movement as a section of the wall recessed by inches, revealing a narrow cavity. Inside lay another metal box, smaller than the one they'd discovered previously, but of similar design. The brass key from Thomas Winfield's effects fit this lock as well. Inside they found a glass plate, negative in early photographic technique, and a small leather-bound notebook filled with chemical formulas and anatomical drawings, far advanced for Civil War-era medicine. "The second component," Margaret breathed, handling the items with reverent care. Robert suspected there was another cache here, but could never locate the trigger mechanism. As the activator serum fully took effect, Rebecca experienced an expanded awareness that was both exhilarating and disorienting. The Beauregard cipher, which had seemed an impenetrable grid of random letters, now revealed subtle patterns, repeating sequences that formed a complex three-dimensional structure in her mind's eye. "I can see it," she whispered, closing her eyes to better visualize the emerging pattern. "It's not just a two-dimensional code. The letters form layers like a molecular structure." Margaret quickly provided paper and pencil from her backpack, and Rebecca began sketching what she perceived, a complex arrangement that resembled modern scientific diagrams of DNA structures, though created a century before such discoveries. "My God," Margaret murmured as the drawing took shape. "It's not just a map to the caches. It's the formula itself, disguised as a cipher. The locations of the gold repositories correspond to molecular binding sites. They worked through the morning as Rebecca's enhanced perception gradually decoded sections of the cipher that had confounded researchers for generations. The star-shaped birthmark on her shoulder now glowed with a faint luminescence visible even through her clothing, responding to her deepened engagement with the family legacy. Their concentration was broken by the sudden blare of vehicle engines approaching the church. Through the broken windows, they spotted 3 black SUVs racing up the overgrown access road. Grayson's federal team had located them. "We need to move now," Margaret urged, gathering their discoveries. "There's a tunnel system beneath the church, part of the underground railroad network repurposed by the Knights. It will lead us to safety." She pressed a specific sequence of flagstones near the altar, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness. As they hurried down the worn steps, Rebecca glanced back to see armed agents entering the church above, Grayson's voice echoing commands through the abandoned sanctuary. The tunnel was low-ceilinged but navigable, illuminated by Margaret's powerful flashlight. "These passages connect several night safe houses," she explained as they moved swiftly through the underground pathway. "They've been maintained by custodians for generations." After 15 minutes of hurried travel, they ascended another staircase, emerging into the cellar of what appeared to be an abandoned farmhouse several miles from the church. Margaret led them to a modern SUV concealed in a dilapidated barn, its appearance of neglect masking sophisticated equipment inside. "We need to retrieve Zoe," Rebecca insisted as they drove away from the property along back roads. "Grayson will target her to control me." "Already handled," Margaret assured her, handing Rebecca a secure satellite phone. "Call this number. Ask for Operation Magnolia." The call connected to Governor Caldwell's security chief, who confirmed that Zoe had been safely extracted from the motel and was currently with Isaiah and Marcus Washington at a secure location outside federal jurisdiction. "The governor has activated state resources to protect your daughter," the security chief explained. "She's being briefed on the situation appropriate to her age. The governor believes young people deserve truth, even when it's complicated." Relief flooded through Rebecca, followed by renewed determination. With Zoe safe, she could focus on the extraordinary task before her, completing the cipher translation while the activator serum still enhanced her cognitive abilities. As they drove toward a rendezvous point where they would meet Caldwell's team, Rebecca continued working with the cipher. Her enhanced perception revealed increasingly complex patterns, including geographic coordinates for the remaining cache locations across the southeast. 7 of the original 17 caches have been compromised over the years, Margaret explained as Rebecca mapped the locations. 3 were seized by federal authorities during Reconstruction. 2 were appropriated by corrupt custodians for personal gain, and 2 were destroyed by natural disasters. That leaves 10 intact caches, Rebecca calculated. Enough to reconstruct the complete formula? Potentially, Margaret nodded. Each cache contains a component of the formula plus gold to fund continued research. Your great-uncle believed that with modern medical technology, the Knight's discovery could be refined into targeted treatments for specific diseases rather than the crude life extension compound they originally created. By mid-afternoon, they had arrived at a sprawling estate hidden in the rural countryside outside Savannah. The antebellum mansion had been restored with painstaking historical accuracy, its grounds protected by state-of-the-art security systems. Disguised within period-appropriate structures, Governor Caldwell greeted them on the columned porch, his wheelchair pushed by a nurse whose professional demeanor couldn't completely mask her watchful security training. "Welcome to Magnolia Haven," he said, gesturing toward the mansion. One of the original Knight safe houses, now preserved as a private historical trust. "You'll be reunited with your daughter inside." The emotional reunion with Zoe momentarily overshadowed the historical significance of their surroundings. The teenager had been frightened, but was now caught up in the adventure of it all, especially after meeting other young people with the distinctive star-shaped birthmark distant cousins from various branches of the extended Winfield-Harrington family network. "We're like a secret society, Mom," she enthused. "Marcus has been showing us historical records about our family going back centuries." Later that evening, as Zoe socialized with her newfound relatives, Rebecca met with Governor Caldwell, Margaret, and several elderly individuals introduced as regional custodians from across the South. In the mansion's wood-paneled library, they reviewed her progress with the cipher translation. "This is extraordinary," said Dr. Eleanor Beaumont, a distinguished medical researcher and custodian from Louisiana. "If these molecular structures are accurate, the Knights had somehow identified cellular regeneration mechanisms that modern science only discovered in the 1990s. And you've managed in hours what teams of researchers couldn't accomplish in decades," Governor Caldwell added, studying Rebecca with thoughtful assessment. "The birthmark truly does convey special cognitive abilities when activated." "Not special," Rebecca corrected, uncomfortable with the implication. "Just different. Pattern recognition enhanced in specific ways relevant to this particular cipher." As they continued analyzing her translations, a security officer entered with urgent news. "Governor, federal agents have established roadblocks on all major approaches to the estate. They're claiming jurisdiction under national security directives." Caldwell seemed unfazed. "Right on schedule. Director Grayson is nothing if not predictable." He turned to Rebecca with unexpected intensity. "The time for academic discussion has ended. Miss Collins, we must now execute the contingency that your great-uncle prepared for the revelation." "Protocol. What exactly does that entail?" Rebecca asked, sensing a significant shift in the room's energy. "A direct appeal to the highest authority," Caldwell replied, nodding to an aide who opened a concealed wall panel, revealing modern communications equipment. "We're going to call the President of the United States." What Rebecca couldn't possibly have anticipated when she first inherited her great-uncle's seemingly worthless warehouse was that she would soon be at the center of a constitutional confrontation between state and federal authorities, with the power to reshape modern medicine and perhaps American history itself. As preparations for this extraordinary communication began, she felt the weight of generations of custodians who had preserved this legacy for a moment when humanity might be ready for its implications. The birthmark on her shoulder pulsed in rhythm with her accelerated heartbeat, a physical manifestation of the connection between past and future that now rested in her hands. The humble librarian from Atlanta, who had once found her greatest adventures within the pages of books, now stood at the threshold of writing a new chapter in American history, one that would challenge fundamental narratives about the nation's past and potentially transform its future. Rebecca stood in the mansion's secure communications center, watching as Governor Caldwell's team established encryption protocols for the presidential call. The surreal nature of her situation struck her anew 6 weeks ago. Her greatest concern had been securing a modest raise at the Atlanta Public Library to cover Zoe's college application fees. Now she stood at the center of a historical revelation that could reshape national narratives dating back to the Civil War. The President is expecting resistance from Director Grayson, Caldwell explained, as technicians finalize the connection. Certain elements within the intelligence community have operated with minimal oversight for generations, particularly regarding historical assets with security implications. Why would the President take our call at all? Rebecca asked, genuine confusion in her voice. We're essentially claiming a conspiracy to suppress medical breakthroughs spanning multiple administrations. Caldwell exchanged glances with Margaret Winfield before responding. Because the current administration has been searching for leverage against entrenched intelligence operations that have accumulated excessive power. Our situation provides a unique opportunity to reassert civilian control. The large monitor on the wall flickered to life, showing the presidential seal for several moments before transitioning to a live feed from the Oval Office. The President, a woman whose election had surprised political observers 2 years earlier, appeared on screen, flanked by the White House Counsel and Chief of Staff. Governor Caldwell, she acknowledged with a respectful nod. I understand. We have an unusual historical situation requiring immediate attention. Madam President, thank you for taking this call on short notice, Caldwell responded formally. May I introduce Rebecca Collins, the current custodian of what we've been referring to as the Beauregard legacy. Rebecca stepped forward, fighting the surreal disorientation of addressing the leader of the free world while federal agents established positions outside the estate. Madam President, I apologize for the unorthodox approach, but circumstances have forced our hand. Over the next 20 minutes, Rebecca presented a concise summary of her discoveries, from inheriting her great-uncle's warehouse to deciphering the Beauregard cipher and identifying the coordinates of remaining caches. Governor Caldwell and Margaret supplemented with historical context and documentation of federal interference led by Director Grayson. The President listened attentively, occasionally conferring quietly with her advisors before addressing them directly. Miss Collins, if I understand correctly, you're claiming that Confederate officers associated with the Knights of the Golden Circle discovered a medical compound with significant life extension properties, concealed components of this formula, in multiple locations across the South, and your family has served as hereditary custodians of this secret for over 150 years. Yes, Madam President, Rebecca confirmed. The evidence suggests the discovery stemmed from archaeological findings, predating European settlement, possibly ancient Egyptian or Phoenician contact with indigenous cultures. And you believe Director Grayson's National Historical Security Division has been suppressing this discovery rather than developing its medical potential? We have documentation spanning decades, Margaret Winfield interjected, transmitting files through the secure connection. The NHSD has systematically contained knowledge of the compound, allowing limited access to certain military and intelligence personnel while preventing broader medical research. The President reviewed the transmitted documents with her staff, her expression unreadable. After several tense minutes, she looked up with new resolve in her eyes. Governor Caldwell, I'm issuing Executive Order 14,118, effective immediately. The National Historical Security Division is placed under direct presidential oversight, pending review of operational practices. Director Grayson is relieved of command, to be replaced by Deputy Director Amanda Chun as interim leadership. She turned her attention to Rebecca. Ms. Collins, I'm authorizing a joint task force comprising NIH medical researchers, historical preservation experts, and representatives from the custodian families to evaluate these cache locations and assess the medical potential of this discovery. This will operate under civilian oversight with complete transparency. The decisiveness of the President's response startled Rebecca. Just like that, after generations of secrecy? A hint of a smile crossed the President's face. Ms. Collins, One advantage of being the first female president is having fewer entanglements with certain old boy networks in the intelligence community. I've been looking for an opportunity to rein in agencies operating beyond proper oversight. You've just provided me with compelling justification. Within the hour, presidential orders had reached the federal agents surrounding the estate. The confrontation transformed into an awkward collaboration as Grayson was escorted away and Deputy Director Chien arrived to coordinate the transition to presidential oversight. Chun, a forthright woman in her 50s with the precise demeanor of a career intelligence professional, met with Rebecca and the custodian representatives in the mansion's main parlor. "For the record," she stated without preamble, "I've advocated for transparency regarding the Beauregard legacy for over a decade. The medical potential far outweighs any historical security concerns, particularly given advances in modern pharmaceutical research." She spread a map across the antique table, marking the 10 remaining cache locations Rebecca had identified. "We have secure facilities capable of analyzing the compound components as they're recovered. The President has authorized expedited transportation and research protocols." Rebecca studied the woman carefully. "You've known about all of this for years?" "Parts of it," Chun acknowledged. "The NHSD compartmentalizes information severely. I knew we were monitoring certain historical assets with medical implications, but the full scope of the night's discovery and the custodian network remained restricted to Grayson's inner circle." The next 3 days unfolded with extraordinary efficiency as presidential authority streamlined operations that would normally have required months of bureaucratic navigation. The custodian families, after generations of secrecy and careful preservation, transitioned to transparent partnerships with medical researchers. The birthmark that had designated custodians for over 150 years became the subject of intensive genetic research, revealing sophisticated bioengineering that challenged conventional understanding of what was possible in the 19th century, or perhaps suggested intervention from sources beyond conventional historical accounting. 6 months after inheriting her great-uncle's seemingly worthless warehouse, Rebecca stood in that same space, now transformed into a state-of-the-art historical research center funded by a foundation established with a portion of the recovered Confederate gold. The building's exterior maintained its historical appearance, but inside, teams of historians, archaeologists, and medical researchers worked collaboratively to fully document the extraordinary legacy she had helped bring to light. "We've identified 3 additional cache locations based on your cipher translations," reported Dr. James Chun, the archaeologist heading the recovery efforts. "Preliminary ground-penetrating radar confirms subterranean structures consistent with night preservation techniques." Zoe, now enrolled in a specialized educational program that accommodated her involvement with the research center, had developed her own role documenting the discovery through photography and digital archiving. The experience had transformed her from a grieving teenager into a confident young woman with a clear sense of purpose. "The Vice President is coming next week to tour the facility," she reminded Rebecca, checking the calendar on her tablet. "The Governor wants to make sure we emphasize both the historical significance and the medical applications in equal measure." Rebecca nodded, still occasionally struck by the surreal nature of her new reality. The humble librarian who had once helped patrons locate obscure reference materials now regularly briefed government officials and medical researchers on a discovery spanning centuries. That evening, as sunset painted the Georgia sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Rebecca visited the small memorial garden that had been established on the property in honor of her great-uncle and the generations of custodians who had preserved the legacy. A simple stone marker bore the names of those who had maintained the secret across decades, often at great personal cost. Isaiah Washington joined her there, his presence a comfortable silence before he finally spoke. "Your uncle would be mighty proud of how you've handled all this." He always said the right custodian would come when the time was right. I still don't understand why me, Rebecca admitted. I had no preparation, no warning that this responsibility would suddenly land in my lap. Isaiah's wise eyes crinkled with gentle amusement. Sometimes the people who change history aren't the ones who spent their lives preparing for greatness. Sometimes they're just ordinary folks who choose to do the right thing when an extraordinary moment finds them. He gestured toward the research center where lights still burned as teams worked into the evening. Look what you've accomplished in 6 months. A medical breakthrough that's already saving lives. Historical truths finally coming to light after generations of suppression. All because you chose to investigate an inheritance that most folks would have walked away from. As twilight deepened around them, Rebecca reflected on the journey that had begun with a certified letter informing her of a dilapidated warehouse left by a great-uncle she barely remembered. What had initially seemed like a burden, perhaps, even a financial liability, had transformed into a purpose that connected her to both past and future in ways she could never have imagined. The birthmark on her shoulder, now understood as a sophisticated genetic marker designed to identify those capable of continuing the custodianship, no longer pulsed with mysterious energy. Its purpose fulfilled, it had returned to appearing as an ordinary birthmark, though Rebecca knew she would never again see it as simply a quirk of genetics. From the research center emerged Zoe, waving excitedly with a tablet in hand. "Mom! Dr. Montgomery just sent preliminary results from the Alzheimer's trials. The compound is showing significant cognitive improvement in 87% of participants." As Rebecca hugged her daughter, celebrating this latest breakthrough, she thought about how profoundly their lives had changed. The inheritance that had once seemed worthless had proven to be beyond price, not just in the recovered gold that now funded research, but in the opportunity to bring healing to a world that desperately needed it. The humble woman who had inherited her great-uncle's warehouse had discovered not just a Confederate general's lost gold, but a legacy of knowledge that spanned centuries and now promised to extend countless lives in the future. In doing so, she had written herself into a historical narrative far larger than she had ever imagined, possible proving that ordinary people, when faced with extraordinary circumstances, can indeed change the course of history through courage, perseverance, and a willingness to embrace an unexpected inheritance. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.